Welcome to the event, Navigating HR Legal Issues in Investigating Employee Fraud, POSH and Ethics Complaints. I am Alipak Banerjee and I'm a leader at Nishith Desai Associates, New Delhi. I will guide you through today's session. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Before we start, I would like to invite Vidya Srinivasan, member NASSCOM Executive Council, and Senior Vice President, Infrastructure and IT, GenPact, to deliver the keynote address for this afternoon.
Actually, it helps if you tell me in advance that I have to do this. I'm just like walking up. But thank you and welcome to everyone. I think couple of pieces. There's so much of evolution happening in all of our regulations that it's a topic that's worth the time that we are spending. So for me, I started as the legal counsel in JEC's GenPact. At some point of time, veered out. I did handle the ombuds role for over 12 years. So I know what this means. I look after enterprise risk. So a part of the fraud piece is something that I am fairly close to, both internal as well as external fraud that comes through. Especially in the world that we are in, I think the regulations were meant to work in a certain way, but as you start implementing the regulations, you realize there are some gray areas. And I'll pick the POSH first. There is obviously a commitment on behalf of companies that once a complaint comes, you investigate, you go through the process, right? And a part of the investigation and the process is internal to us, which means how do I handle the complainant in the course of the investigation? How do we, do we feel there is a good reason for us? And those are internal rules. Good reason to keep the so-called the person against whom the complaint has been filed, on leave, on suspension, etc. Right? What ends up happening is there is a conflict of jurisdiction sometimes, or at least a perceived conflict. Okay. For example, if someone chooses to raise a complaint which we are going through and it leads to something in the meanwhile which happens, which is not the right thing. And I'm now referring, all of you probably know the Noida incident where we had an employee who committed suicide, right? Now the police will come and say, but you should have come to us first. Does that mean for every complaint that goes to the police? Because there are all ranges of harassment complaint and workplace complaints, from relatively minor, which is probably poor language, to more serious ones. At least in my experience, and I think a lot of you who are handling these cases will know that 60 to 70% of the complaints that come conservatively are actually relationships that have gone wrong. It started right, and then something went wrong, and one person files a complaint, right? So I think there is that place which is in a no man's land, saying, what is the right thing to do? Do I go to the police first because I just feel that from an equity standpoint, until the facts are proven, the person against whom the complaint is filed is innocent. And so should we just jump the gun, take them to the cops and make sure that they get, in many cases, the treatment that they get is not necessarily the fairest, right? Of course, there is an inbuilt bias in our system, which assumes that complaints are filed only by women, which is actually, if you look at data, many times it's wrong. There could be complaint of woman to woman, man to man, woman to man, man to woman. All of them happen. So, at least in our case, and I'm sure in many other cases, it ends up becoming, sort of convoluted, because then there is this gender piece that comes in. Then there is this, at least when I saw from outside, when I see the Noida incident for us, there is this whole thing of, BPO company, people being more progressive versus the society, because if the girl is someone who filed a complaint when she was probably drunk, she's automatically discounted. Everything she says is discounted. There is this whole social reality that we work with, and you have to navigate it. Whether we like it or not, especially when it goes to the law enforcement agencies. And, you all see enough movies, of Pink and Highway 10 or whatever it's called, where this has played out and it's very real. So I think that's a challenge for us. And how do we make sure we are equitable to both sides of the story? I think is the biggest risk for us. The piece which is unclear, especially when it comes to the police, etc., is, we are damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. If you take the case where, there is a complaint and the complaint leads to someone either going to the social media or doing something, more drastic. So if I rewind and we didn't do anything and we went to the cops and this happened, we would still have been, dinged, saying you had a POSH committee, why didn't you handle it? Here we did everything in accordance with POSH, even then we got dinged. So this is a bit of a no-win situation. I think what is important, a huge learning for us is, at least for us, I think a few of us who've lived through this, is do what is the right thing as per the rules, as per law, okay? The noise that comes, and I will call it noise, the noise that comes in the social media, in the press, quite often poorly informed, and that's the beauty of social media. It gives you this anonymity to comment on anything. Just don't let that impact you. I think we had points of time when you wanted to react, but I think it takes a lot of discipline and maturity to say, no, let me steer the course the right way. Because this slugfest that happens in the social media of you did this versus me did this, and we all have been to some extent parties to it at some point in time. Just make sure that you sort of keep your dignity through that discourse. I can tell you that the 1 odd month when this whole thing was at its peak, huge pressure on us, right? Our own employees thinking we didn't do the right thing in some cases, until the gravity of the situation came out. So I think we should be clear in this case that you follow the rules and just trust that the judicial system will do it right. The only thing is that the judicial system works at its own pace, and when you are in the middle of that storm, that pace sort of comes to bite you, honestly. But I think in the end it works. So that's the big piece on one piece on for sure learning on POSH that we have. I don't want to undermine the importance of documentation. It is so important when you have these complaints. And after this thing is over, you guys should speak to Bakul and Latika. They're part of the Genpact team and they handle it. They said, you're going to put us under the bus. But given a number of people, okay, if you just take NCR, Genpact is about 28,000 people, just between Noida and Gurgaon, right? So there will obviously be some complaints that will come up, etc. So making sure you have the right kind of documentation, I think, is extremely important, because it has to stand the test. And here is the pressure that comes, okay? The pressure that comes from operations or your business is take quick action. How many of you have said, why don't we fire this guy? Okay, he's done this, why don't we fire this guy? There's a fraud or alleged fraud, why don't we it doesn't work like that. There is a reality in our life which is called, rule of law, and we have to follow it. It actually becomes even worse when it is cases of fraud, where there is, let's say, your client data involved, or something that's happened where something about, can you just dim that please, it's coming into my eyes, sorry. I'm sort of squinting. Where your client data is involved, if someone has misused it or attempted to misuse it, there is pressure that will come from our customers. I think what is important is for the right people to have the conversation. You made it brighter, by the way. Is for the client, counterparts, whether it is their fraud team or their legal team, to explain the process. It is not that they don't have procedures when it comes to investigating frauds, or how you can't just put someone behind bars until you have a reasonably good case. And you have to go to the cops, you have to go to the cybercrime cell, and let's face it, our cybercrime cells are also learning as they go along. So we have to help them with those cases. And I think that pressure is something for a lot of you who are, in the in-house teams handling investigations, to educate, and we do that. And I can tell you, we're not popular for it, because if you go and tell a business leader that, yeah, this case has started, but I need 10 days to investigate it because I need to get all the facts. Sometimes you don't have all the data with you. Sometimes the data is actually with your client, because you're working off client systems, the evidence is sitting with them. It's not they don't like that answer. But I think what is important is to sort of take the right people in the organization and tell them why we shouldn't do it. Because you do something knee-jerk, it will come back to bite you. Now my biggest concern when, even fraud cases are there is, are we doing the right thing on record? Because, anyone, two things that are a problem. It's a volatile world, people do anything they feel like. Okay, someone will threaten, like this guy, I think he got fired, and in Gurgaon he went on top of a terrace and threatened to jump, right? The other is, of course, this beautiful thing, which can also be horrible, called social media. You can just go and say anything to anyone. Even routine cases of, or all of you, which are of exits, which are done the right way for performance, for discipline, you just get maligned. I think that's why I keep saying that social media, beyond a point, is it shouldn't drive your behavior. You should sort of, yes, take it into account, especially when it is something which is, constructive, but don't start reacting to every tweet and every, LinkedIn post and everything. I mean, because if you do it, you're funneling that engine even more, and if you are sort of more controlled, then it sort of tends to manage itself. At least those are, and the other obviously is for us, because we are a company that handles a lot of data. I'm switching to the fraud side. Keep relooking at your processes, because I just feel there is data that sits there, and when you transitioned or migrated something, it was something, and then it changed its shape because you added new work types to it. Are you making sure you are constantly revisiting your control points? Are you revisiting your checkpoints? More important, are you doing an internal stress test on your system on how easy? Do you do fraud assessments? Not easy, because sometimes the fraud assessment has to also go into the client system. But I can tell you, whenever we speak to their risk officers or their fraud teams, they are more than happy to partner with us in most cases. So making sure you are very much you're part and parcel of that game with them, and telling them the kind of, because 15 years back, the kind of frauds we saw were much simpler. I think as people have got comfortable with this industry, technology, I think the sophistication in the frauds has become much higher, much tougher to detect actually. I know of situations where there is fraud which involves collusion of the retained organization, which means the client's person is colluding with our people to create a fraud. There are genuine frauds. So, there are UK, for example, some banks, there have been phishing efforts which have, come to our client, and then we've come through. I think it's important for us to look at that. One learning we've had is, when you see something that's going wrong, or you see some unusual pattern in one part of your business, just make sure you carpet bomb the complete business regardless of where it sits, if it is a product type. I can give you only examples that are relevant to my world. So if you do accounts payable, or you do vendor master setup, or you do reconciliations, or you do bank recs, and you find some anomalies, right? Make sure you touch every accounts payable as far as possible, regardless of the vertical. Whether it's a CGRLH vertical or a banking vertical, just make sure you do that sense check, because that's where you start tightening the screws. I do want to say a lot of this, not so much harassment, but fraud, is very closely intertwined with policies, and secondly with technology. Finding the right kind of technology to help you, sort of detect patterns. But sometimes, at least in the world I come from, people feel if you get a tool, it solves your problem. It doesn't. It probably solves 50% of your problem. It is really driven by culture. It is really driven by, are you asking the right questions? Are you raising it to the management? When you see something, are you putting a stop to it till you clarify? The simple ones, for all of you who are part of some form of financial services, the whole penny test. When someone sets up and changes an account or a detail of an account, do that, $1, $half test to see if it goes through. We don't do it when you do volume transactions. We sort of tend to go slightly lax. I think that rigor is really, really important. And I know it's not easy, because when someone is doing several thousand transactions a month, you sort of let some pass. And that dilution of controls is something we have to be careful about, both for your own money, which you do as companies, and obviously the custody of your customers and their data. So eventually it's boiling down to diligence, it's boiling down to conflicts that will exist. I think, at least on the POSH piece, it is, and we are very consciously sort of not commented on POSH, because we were at the receiving end of it for quite a long time, but I think now we will. I think the enactment is the right thing, but it has the implementation where there are gaps, and I think there is clarification needed. And I also think if you start dinging companies that actually are following it the way they should, then it's actually doing a huge disservice to the intent of the enactment. Like this whole piece that came against the Chief Justice of India, and then there are interesting questions, right? Who will police the judicial system? We don't have any easy answers to those, and I think the corporates are sitting ducks. Everything we do, you're always like, you didn't do this, and in hindsight, you're obviously your vision is 6 by 6. But when you're in the middle of it, how do we work through it is important. The only piece I can say is in safe groups, especially like these, speak to your peers. I spoke to some of my peers who had been through similar, if not the same situation, right? These are safe groups where you can talk and learn, and we try and do as much of it as we can, whether it is fraud or it is harassment. And I can tell you, when you join hands, because especially in case of frauds and financial frauds, there are people who jump companies, but it's the same pattern. And unfortunately, in the name of competition, in some cases, people don't do the right background check or don't share the right data with them. They sort of, because you want to get off without too much of a pain, you give them a clean chit release, and then they go somewhere else and they sort of precipitate it. What is important is obviously, for us to make sure that we are sharing it at least with the peer group on a reciprocal basis. One example we've had, I don't know if there's anyone here from Amex, but there was a case of a person committing fraud on client accounts on data, a significant amount. When it came in the paper, we realized we had the same person working with us on similar fact patterns. And of course, we were working with the cops. We've now joined hands with them, because that person's got, the Amex case is ahead of the curve on the fraud, and said we want to now become party to that and share our details. So I think competition is the right thing, but on things like ethics, it's good to shake hands, because there are a bunch of people who keep doing it over and over and get away with it. That's really all I had. I do feel a lot for this because, I feel at least for most of the large corporations, we want to do the right thing. Both in terms of, because for us, it's about employee morale and stickiness, and also what is right for our customers. And, as our shareholders, we want to make sure that there's nothing that makes them feel that we are not doing the right thing. But then when you have the headwinds, sometimes you question yourself, but I think, I don't know how many of you know Hindi, but hum honge kamyab, just keep plowing on and you'll figure out a solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Vidya, for the address. Moving on to our first panel discussion. The technical session is on HR and legal issues in employee misconduct, non-compliance and breach. Let me introduce the speakers. The first speaker is Mr. Nanjappa Somanna, Vice President, Human Resource, Infosys. Can you please come on the stage? The second panelist is Mr. Sachin Datta, Head Human Resource, TJX Companies, India. Sachin, can you please come on the stage? The third panelist is Vikram Shah, Head Employment Law Practice, Nishith Desai Associates. And I'll also join the panel. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all for joining. My name is Vikram. I lead the employment law team at Nishith Desai Associates. I'll request each panelist to spend about 20 seconds just introducing themselves and basically telling about the background where they come from so that you can relate to them better in terms of their views. So maybe starting with Nanjappa, if you just want to introduce yourself.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here and share and learn. I never let go of an opportunity to connect with fellow HR folks and others. I've been with Infosys for about 17 years now, a subject very close to my heart, about 15 years of ER, never a dull moment. Just when you know that you've seen it all and there comes a couple more. And then, so a lot of empathy and sympathy with the folks who actually run these programs. I think that's the group we have to focus on more than anything else to have a better organization and every other thing. But otherwise, looking forward to hearing from all of you and co-panelists, and we'll see how it goes.
Thanks, Nanjappa. Thank you okay. Can we share this? Right. Thank you so much for inviting us, Vikram. It's a real pleasure to be here. My name is Sachin. I represent TJX. Some of you might not know about it because it's a retailer which has about 4,200 stores worldwide, mostly in US, Europe, and Canada. We spread across 3 continents and employ close to about 250,000 people. In India, we have our buying and sourcing division, which is quite relatively new. So I represent the HR function, and it's a quite newish organization that we have in India. and this is extremely important to us since we are a listed company in the New York Stock Exchange. So compliance is extremely important. That's what we believe in, and that's what I'm here for, to learn and share our experiences as to what we do, what are the challenges that we face at times. Before joining TJX about 1.5 years back, I was in the Middle East, again with a retailer of Indian origin called Landmark, Mickey Jagtiani's company. I was heading HR in Bahrain, and prior to that I was in Saudi Arabia. So spent about 8 years in Middle East, and now I'm here and happy to be back home.
Hi, real pleasure to be here. My name is Ali Pak. I have been working with Nishith Desai for last 6 years. I focus on cross-border disputes and investigations, and as part of my role, I also have worked a lot on employment litigation in last couple of years. I look forward to this session. Over to Vikram.
Okay, so thank you all. This is just a background. So we have HR experts and we have lawyers that focus on employment law, employment litigation. The HR experts come from a background, in one case, Indian headquartered MNC, and the other case, US headquartered MNC, right? So both of them are going to be sharing their respective perspectives on how they look at the same situation or same issue, you know, the protocols that they follow. Now, our panel was kind of structured in a way that we really talking of the core HR issues that lead to an investigation. And then the next panel, the way it's structured, would talk about how to go about with that investigation. So we are in a way trying to see if there are issues that warrant investigation, and if there are issues, if there is something that can be done that it does not go to the next stage or does not blow up. And that's really the context of it. And feel free to ask questions. We want to keep it as interactive as possible. So if you want to, if you have a specific question for any one of us, if you have a perspective to share, feel free to do that, when it's the right moment. Now, just in terms of, there was a recent sort of WhatsApp image talking about the most polluted cities in the world, and Gurgaon kind of was on top of that list. So we are hopefully here to clear the air somewhat, at least in relation to the issues that we have at hand. And hopefully, after the end of the first panel, you'll get some clarity of how, on how experts look at the same issue from their perspective, and maybe some guidance for you from, from based on their experience. So really the first first subtopic, can you actually put on the slides if that's available? Okay, okay, I'll just quickly run through the topics. No, not this one, the earlier one. Yeah. So this is really what we are going to cover in the 30 minutes that we have. What is misconduct? How extensively is defined in your policies? Whistleblowing mechanisms, whether you accept anonymous complaints, harassment versus fraud versus breach, different types of misconduct, how do you look at it? How do you handle a complaint under POSH? Vidya spoke about it in the previous, in her keynote. So that's something we're going to touch upon. To investigate or not to investigate, right? That is the question. So what do you investigate? Again, we'll sort of share our perspectives. And again, finally, we'll probably conclude with, what do you do when something is proved or something that you're aware? Would you go about with a resignation? Would you look to terminate and fire the employee? Something, again, just to get people's perspective. So let's start with the first point, and maybe I'll ask Nanjappa to kind of begin the session on what exactly is misconduct according to him as an HR expert. What are those situations that could really lead to, according to him, misconduct? And more importantly, just not at Infosys, but maybe other companies, and obviously he's, quite popular in the HR fraternity. So how extensively is misconduct defined in your policies? Are employees aware that certain acts are misconduct? How detailed do you go? Is it customized to your organization, or do you just sort of pick up and, put it into your policy? So maybe start off with that.
Thanks so much. So at a very elementary level, unacceptable behavior really is misconduct. But our experience has been, the more you know, you figure how less you know. We've been able to add a lot more to that repertoire of what misconduct is over the last few years. with the advent of, say, social media, with the advent of technology, privacy, a lot of things have changed in terms of what a misconduct is. And because of all the new generation and things like that, we've started looking at this in a very new context. So that's very important to know, because we've constantly evolved around the space, one. Second, we have obviously have an overarching view of what misconduct is. It's articulated in your code of conducts, in your employee handbooks. We have our own standing orders that's signed, which is about 20 years old now. There are enough processes and policies which articulate what it is. So more at a overall level and at specifics. What we've also done is, just to make this clear, because we have a large employee base, in India it's about 120,000 people, we want to make sure that it's articulated very well. So we've gone to specifics, and against each misconduct, we've tried to give the usual action that happens, minus the context, so that it's clear to people on what it means. So that the philosophy and the articulation is out of the way, we then move into the education part of it, because the education is again very important. So we've segmented the education part. So the new joinees looked at differently, the freshers are looked at differently, the experienced hires, etc. So, and of course, there are other, the different locations are looked at differently, so that the education gets better and better. We've also gamified it successfully to make sure that people understand it. We've used digital a lot more, and we've tried to partner with other bigger brands in the company which has top of mind, to integrate some of these things, because this is a topic which is very, very boring. So we've tried to make this a little more interesting, so that people kind of are able to understand. Second, we've also tried to use analytics to see how some of these things can get interesting, and then segment our education based on some of those things. So that's how we've been able to get to this whole space. Now, we constantly revise it. We constantly add to this, and like I said, over the last few years, we've been able to significantly add more areas to this, so that the first point, which is about every employee understanding that the fact that this is a misconduct. Now, there are two parts to this again. One, people know it, but yet they still do it. Or it happens by mistake or whatever. So the other thing that we've tried to do from a misconduct point of view is we've tried to put in governances, so that systemically you're able to hold off a few things. That's very, very important for us in this whole misconduct piece. The third thing we've tried to do, and very, very focused interventions, is on reporting. Not just in this space, but also in the POSH and every other. We believe reporting, if it's encouraged, and we figure a way of making sure that these issues bubble up, and we've tried peer level interventions and things like that, we've been successful to an extent. The reporting part becomes important, so that we know that these things are happening in the company. So these are some things that, some of my thoughts around the misconduct part, and we'll get your views before we go ahead.
I think absolutely great points. I love the way you're using gamification. And as you said, and the other panelist has said earlier, the way the world is evolving right now with the advent of social media becoming part and parcel of our everyday lives, I was very surprised to see that in an employment contract now, in one of the companies that I was talking to, one of the head HRs, and in Middle East. And so in Middle East, the penetration of social media is very, very high. I think even in a country like Saudi Arabia, the penetration of Twitter is one of the highest across countries. So how do you deal with a situation like that? So they look at various factors. Obviously, number one is educating the employees. There are various ways to do that, and I think Infosys has some great practices. And secondly, I think they have gone to the extent where they want to put in a clause in the appointment letter or in the job contract itself. So it's taking up that shape as well in some of the countries that I've seen. Talking about TJX, it's clearly articulated. We pride ourselves in open door policies and diversity as well. So the education part, yes, it can get boring. I mean, nobody likes to do those online tests and get certified. So we try to keep it as engaging as possible. But awareness is critical, constantly evolving to the needs and demands of the modern society and the world that we are living in right now is extremely critical, and emphasizing it and practicing it as we go along, I think. And then we got something to learn from Infosys as well. So no doubt you have the best technology and you're using it to make it as interactive. So that's a great learning.
Yeah, so I mean, again, just giving the lawyer's perspective, the experience suggests that one size does not really fit all when it comes to defining what is misconduct, how extensive you want to be in, referring to it. And again, what's emerging is that besides that sort of training employees that these are the areas that we look at or consider misconduct, it's a constantly evolving kind of a area. So something that you would probably have done 5 years back and put it in your handbook, you might want to relook at it and see if it applies in today's world. And you come across a lot of instances, social media, exactly, right? Somebody writing something random, some religious hatred speech on social media. He might not even name himself as an employee of the company, but the point is that he's maybe at a certain level that everyone can associate that person with a particular company. And then how do you deal with that? So unless you have that expressly clarified, it just kind of makes it easier for you to initiate some sort of disciplinary action if something has happened. So it's a constantly evolving thing, at least based on what's emerging from that.
Yeah, especially in the domain that we work in. So technology, the two examples that I can think of is one is information technology. We work very elaborately with experts within the organization outside to define misconduct and things like that, because we don't have too much of an idea on some parts of it. And we've learned from working with experts. Data privacy is the other thing, and other geographies as well. So working with experts both inside the organization and outside, we've been able to define this, and we've been able to figure what's coming, because often in many cases we see that we react after the incidents happen. So in some cases, because we work with experts, we're able to figure a few things that's coming. So mostly in the misconduct area.
So the list of acts constituting misconduct in the Standing Orders Act and in today's real world situation is likely to be completely different, right? So that's what. Okay, moving on quickly to the next subtopic. We seen quite a few employee grievance mechanisms in organizations that at some point it's also mandatory to have employee grievance mechanisms. We've seen whistleblowing channels quite popular, even though it is not mandatory for all companies, especially private companies in India. One of the risks of a whistleblowing mechanism is that it allows someone to file a complaint anonymously, right? Either the complainant's name is not there or probably not enough information to investigate. So maybe just wanted the panel to share their experience, how they look at their own whistleblowing channels. Are they allowing anonymous complaints? And if so, have they had any practical challenges dealing with anonymous complaints? We know POSH Act, right? It doesn't really allow anonymous complaints, to that extent. So how are you looking at it in your case? Just wanted the team to share their perspectives.
Yeah, so we have, like I said, we have a very clearly defined policy around grievance mechanism as well, and we encourage open door as a company. Having said that, it sometimes becomes very uncontrollable, because not only do we propagate in our employees about the importance of open door, we also extend it to our vendors as well, that if they have something that they have to do. Now, when we thrive in a business where there are huge vendor relations, you do get a lot of anonymous complaints. Some of them can be malicious as well, and it's a huge task, frankly, to segregate where you want to really go in after and what you want to avoid, and you can't actually avoid anything. So that's the dilemma that we face. Do we have a clear answer to it right now? No, because we look at everything that comes our way. Some of it is maybe a disgruntled vendor, or even could be a disgruntled employee as well, and just been through, let's say, a personal issue with somebody and wants to use that channel. So this channel does get abused at times, but that doesn't take away the beauty of having this. So I'm a strong propagator of this. I mean, we should have a grievance mechanism and a whistleblower policy, or an open door policy. But from an HR business partner side, it becomes an incredible big task to, again, next question, when to investigate and when not to investigate. So again, we do get emails, we sometimes get letters. Our policies we address to each one of them. Some of them turn out to be hoax at a later stage, but we want to be at a stage where we address rather than the other way around, where you've not addressed something thinking it's a hoax. So that's my take on that one.
So, to step back, what's important again is the reporting part. The reason is that our role doesn't start when the complaint hits you. I think it starts much before. And that's the important part. And we have to figure out various ways to know that whether you are aware of the issues that are happening in your organization. I think that's fundamental, which means reporting, which means culture, and Vidya touched upon it, which means culture, which means how openly you're engaging with your employees at various levels, whether it's real time or any other. So the efforts we are trying to make is around the engagement, because it's important for people to, converse with you at various forums. That's one, so that you have an idea of what's happening in different parts of the organization. And because it's a large organization and different locations and kinds of people, right? So it's important the engagement has to continue throughout. That's one. Second, the reporting part. How do you encourage reporting? So those are the two things that you have to, other than the culture part, is the fact that you have to, before you get into the complaint itself. Second, all organizations, including ours, have a very well-established policy on whistleblower and all of that. And in our organization, the legal team actually runs it more than the ER team and HR team. But we will partner closely. We have provided employees with various platforms to raise their concerns, depending on what the kind of concern is. They could go to whistleblower as well. We try and give them the psychological safety to say that, hey, it's completely confidential and all of those things, so that people are more forthcoming, because that's the part we want to fix more than anything else. And then, of course, there's whistleblowers complaints process, and then people can, there's a hotline, email, and your HR anchor and things like that. So there are multiple parts to this. Plus, we have forums, different kinds of forums for different kinds of things. Once it hits, of course, we do our internal process depending on where it needs to fall, and then it follows this due course. Two things. One, it's rigorously looked at by leadership, and that's why there's so much more attention to some of these things, both the pre and the post, which is very, very important. The kinds of things that are coming up in whistleblower. Third, we encourage both anonymous and not. In fact, we've gone one step ahead and put boxes in campuses where people can actually put those things, not just for vendor employees, but even our employees, and with their names and if required. We encourage both. The anonymous ones become tricky because you have to then converse with people and then get more details and things like that. But we still do things in good faith and see if a preliminary review and see if it can be taken forward with the information that's available. If it's not, then we kind of have to drop it and move forward. If not, we go out with a full-fledged one. But the point I'm trying to make is we're very sure about the process and the policy and all of that. I think we're very sure about it. What's important is whether all of these things are coming to you, and whether you have a culture where people can speak up, whether you have a culture where people feel safe. I think that's very, very important in any of these categories of complaints. And are there enough forums for them to is it easy for them to kind of get to that forum? That's the part. You have to make it absolutely simple, touch of a button. We're trying to move many things to digital where one or two things. In fact, now we've launched a chatbot for some of these things where you get questions and answers and queries, because we thought people are not comfortable to go to a person. So we thought we will try this and see if maybe the chatbot is going to be neutral and just give you some answers. It may not be very deep answers, but still we have piloted in some places to see the reactions. We've done some pulse and survey to see how employees are going to react to this, but we have tried it. Because otherwise, sometimes people may not want to go to the HR person or write an email to the IDs that we've given our hotline and things like that. So we're trying various ways, but this is how we've started looking at some of these things.
I'll just add on a point on the culture bit. I think that's the most important, where you create a culture where people know that if they raise an issue, there will not be any act or anything which will be in a revengeful manner determined to them. So that's very, very important to create a culture. So I'll share a good practice that what we're doing at TJX. we're conducting we have our values like every company has and competencies. So we've come across various things, and we are right now training people extensively across the organization on how to build trust. So it's a systematic investment of time, money, and effort to have that culture of trust within the organization. That all right, if you want to bring up something, trust the organization that will stay safe. You're in a safe environment, and we will look after you. So that is what we are doing in order to build an environment where people can speak up, where even your vendor community can speak up, and they know that okay, they will be protected, and a timely action, if it warrants, will take place. So that's very, very important to build that culture in the organization. Otherwise, these mechanisms, people really fear, to be honest, to go to them. So unless you have that kind of culture where the mind is without fear, so that's for me the step number one. Absolutely right.
Yeah, and just a perspective, we are dealing with a case right now. It's a US headquartered company in the media sector where their whistleblowing or their ethics hotline was open to outsiders as well. It was not just limited to employees and vendors, they opened it to outsiders, and they've actually got a complaint about an HR practice not being correct in the organization from an outsider, and it's kind of warranting some sort of investigation considering they are sort of headquartered in the US and they're governed by US law. So also your whistleblowing anonymous complaints, the question is whether you want to limit it to your employees, do you want to extend it to third parties with whom you have relationships, and then to outsiders, completely different segment, so that's another consideration. I've just got an indication we are not doing great on time, so we're going to skip 2 points. We're going to skip harassment, fraud, and breach. We were going to talk about the different kinds of misconduct and how our experts look at it from their perspective, yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah, it'll be partly covered. Also, Vidya spoke about POSH quite extensively. So, in fact, she made a reference to the Noida incident. And unfortunate, I mean, it's a beautiful law. It's meant for the right purpose, and it unfortunate consequence of a law. What it was not really intended to uh, sort of play that way, right? Unfold that way. But unfortunately, we've seen these kind of incidents. So again, we were going to talk about how important it is to train your ICC to investigate POSH complaints, but maybe we'll skip that for the moment. Again, if we have time, we'll touch upon in the other session. We'll move on to the second last point, which is the question really, which also flows into the next panel, to investigate or not to investigate. At what point will HR or legal feel that yes, it's necessary to formally investigate a particular employee misconduct, and at what point they would believe that what, this is fine, we are just going to take a decision. So maybe just spending a minute or two on that second last point. At what stage would they feel that yes, a formal investigation is required? Obviously there are laws requiring you to investigate if you're headquartered or listed in India, listed in US, there are different perspectives, but beyond that, from an HR perspective, just wanted to share their experience.
So a couple of points. I think obviously yes is the answer, but there are a couple of things that I want to talk about. One, the intent and the push in the organization should be to make sure the resolution of an issue is closest to where it arises. I think that's the most important part in a philosophy like this, because the greater the distance, the success rate becomes lesser and lesser, which means the framework on the ground has to be so strong, so empowered, that employee resolutions happen in a quick and in a speedy and a very fair manner. This is very important, because if the resolution mechanisms are at the central part of the organization, it will not work. Which is why you have to localize this and empower it a lot more, because otherwise everything will move back to Supreme Court, and Supreme Court will have no time to handle all these issues. So you'll have to have very good district courts who will resolve problems, and they will close it within that time frame and things like that. It's very, very important and empowered, and they have to be experts and things like that. Now, coming to the reason why I brought this question up is because the second point is the engagement I spoke about, that constantly you are doing surveys and account levels and location levels and things like that, so that you are aware of the things that could become bigger than what it is. These are the 2 points that are very, very important. Then it'll be easier for an organization to decide the investigation or not to investigate. Because once it hits your mailbox or once you get to know of the issue, you will go through the investigation, the documentation part in the future, you're firewalling the organization, looking at the employee, all of those things is a no-brainer. But the other part is you will have to know of certain things that will come, or the certain hotspots in your organization which could erupt into something bigger, which means it could be a manager behavior, it could be some location which is doing things differently, it could be various things. And analytics will provide you with certain amount of details as well. That will give an organization better discretion on the investigate and not investigate part, if you ask me. Once it hits you, it doesn't matter, you have to, and then you'll have to, like I said, firewall the organization. But what's important for a good to great organization part is to know some of your hotspots in advance. And most organizations, if they look carefully, will know. It's just that they look the other way. And that's important. And once you do that, this question is actually not even relevant.
Yeah, and in fact, at times there is a general reluctance to investigate, especially the internal inquiry process under the principles of natural justice that you have to follow in case of certain kinds of misconduct, and you just can't terminate, right? And at least we've seen some resistance that why do I have to go through this process? Why can't I just terminate? But again, experience suggests that the moment you do it once or twice, and as Nanjappa said, you need those experienced people to be able to tackle it then and there. It's really a procedural issue, and you're just building that capabilities to handle it over and over again rather than shying away from it. Sachin, Alipak, do you have any inputs on that, or maybe we go on to the last point? Yeah, okay, great. So last point for our panel is resignation versus termination. So once there is a misconduct established, you come across the employee wanting to resign because he knows he's cornered, or maybe the employer is still not comfortable terminating. There's always a question mark whether the process was followed, whether the punishment inflicted is kind of proportionate to the act of misconduct, and those kind of questions keep coming up. Whether there are evidence was unclear, especially in POSH kind of situations where things happen in a closed door kind of an environment and there's no evidence or witnesses. So at times we've seen a reluctance to actually terminate. They would prefer the employee to resign and close the matter, thinking that that's litigation or risk-free kind of a thing. At times, and at least in recent times, we've seen employers coming back and questioning that why would we want the employee to escape if he's done a fraud or a misconduct or a breach or something like that. Why should I not terminate? And I'm serving two purposes. I'm teaching him a lesson that he should not be doing this wherever else he goes. And second, I'm actually creating a deterrent for the rest of the employees in my organization that this is what happens when you do something like this. So any perspectives of how you would look at it differently, or whether, let's say a situation where the employee comes and is willing to resign based on a particular misconduct or based on even an investigation that's ongoing, and how would you deal with that situation?
I'll just like to say that we have to deal it on a case-to-case basis. You cannot have a holistic approach. Okay, we will not terminate anybody and we'll just take resignations. And I just heard the first speaker say where there was a fraud done by some employee at some organization which has served another organization. Now, if that organization had done a proper job of terminating that employee, maybe that could have been prevented, right? Because what happens at the end of the day, in the system, it will be recorded as voluntary resignation. If there's a ref check later on, you will not get the right picture. So I think you're doing a lot of disservice to other organizations, and especially in an era where there's not such a strong database and we do not get the absolute ref check. Ref check is still, it's done in many organizations, done in various ways and forms, but still not as robust as it should be. I strongly believe that particular incident that was quoted as an example, it was a real case, could have been averted. So it has to be dealt on a case-to-case basis, depending on the severity. I think whatever the situation demands after a thorough investigation, doing all of the above, and again, like my colleague said, not colleague, my panel speaker said that, if you set the things right, you should not land up in situations like this if you get the pulse of the organization right. But if you do come across a situation where you're thoroughly convinced after a detailed investigation, you've followed all the process, I think as an organization, you got to do the right thing, and if the situation warrants termination, you got to go in for that rather than choosing an easy path and just taking a resignation and creating traps for the organization.
I agree with him. I think if the situation so demands, I think the employer should terminate. Of course, there could be further litigation on that, and the concerned employee can fight a case, but that is a question of subsequent discussion. Fearing just to avoid a litigation scenario for near future, I think that should not stop someone from taking a stringent step.
There's a fine balance. We've evolved over time, back and forth. It's not an easy answer. When you start off many years ago, it's different, and then you kind of, and most organizations who I speak to have been going back and forth. There's a fine balance between, like I said, protecting the organization and empathizing with the person who's going through it and the employee. It's a fine balance for many things, not for all cases, but maybe for some. As we speak, we are now clear about the fact that it will be termination for all severe cases, and there's no looking back. Having said that, we've also kept an appeal mechanism open, which is actually chaired by senior leaders of the organization, where an employee can appeal or request for an opportunity to resign. It's very far and few. It goes through a thorough review and appeal. It includes general counsels, includes leadership of the organization who will review it and then say, based on maybe humanitarian grounds, if it can be reconsidered. So we've kept a door open just in case, because you can't really brush everybody with the same thing. We've kept an appeal process open, but otherwise we've moved to a place where we've said, if it's severe, we just move on. We take action and we move on, and it's just a thing that, I mean, just so that it's consistent across the, but we've, like I said, kept that appeal process open just in case, and very far and few we try and see what we can do. There are some tricky situations where people leave when the investigation is on, and there again we take a call based on, and this is what some other companies do as well, that we take a call on how severe it is and then see how we want to take it forward. But the appeal part has, I think, in a way worked for us in I mean, you can obviously say no to the appeal, but there is still a window.
No, a very interesting point, and I guess we can keep talking about it. There's never really a right answer. As Sachin said, it's always going to be seen on a case-to-case basis. But as a mindset, as management, you need to take a particular position. Whether you want to eliminate litigation, whether you want to allow the employee to go scot-free, or whether you want to teach him a lesson. It's all kind of subject to debate and discussions, and I guess we will never really have enough time to conclude that. I just wanted to thank our panel. I believe the discussions were really helpful, at least for me, to understand their perspectives, and I hope for you. We are willing to take on questions. I know there's a next panel lined up, but if there are any questions, maybe we'll just take a couple of them.
Hi, I'm Bakul. I lead employee relations for Genpact in India. Interesting subjects we have picked up, and some of them are very relevant to what we do daily. Just a couple of comments on a few topics. We do also have an appeal process, and when people want to resign and they quote humanitarian grounds, and but then there is also an angle of arm twisting and blackmailing that they sometimes indulge in. So they may say that I'll go and commit suicide if you terminate me, right? So that's quite tricky and sticky at the same time. So what do we typically do in other organizations is what I'm keen to understand. The second is on the subject where we spoke about when to investigate and when not to investigate. Very interesting point made by you, sir, where you said that the resolution of issue lies closer to where it arises, which also means empowering a lot of our HR folks who are on the ground. What we typically do is, while the empowerment continues, even if something doesn't hit our hotline or our ombudsperson ID, we determine the complexity of that issue. So if it is a high complexity and it actually is an alleged integrity violation, we would typically pick it up and investigate, irrespective of the fact that it should have been probably closed or there should have been some firewalls, etc. So I just wanted to make a comment on that, and I'm keen to know on the arm twisting angle.
Yeah, it always happens. That's why I said just when we realize that we've seen it all, then there are a few more which are very. So the complexity of cases has definitely gone up in my mind. Although the numbers are few, large governance and large conduct has improved in because there's awareness and things like that. In our experience, more often than not, we close with a termination. We don't really change our decision. We may give support and things like that, but we don't really change it. But like I said, it really depends on context, on the incident, the impact, and of course the intent and things like that. There, I think sometimes we take a call and say, okay, we'll let this go. And then there's a lot of deep discussions around it, and there's a leadership endorsement around that. But we try and avoid the emotional outburst part. We try and see if we can delay it and try and deal with it. But that usually doesn't become a baseline for change in decision. We don't. We full-fledgedly support the employee, and in fact, many times even the family, to deal with it. And we've got the family involved, and we've done all sorts of things to make sure that finally it's an employee of ours, so we have to go all out. So we do that for sure, but that usually doesn't change our decision too much. But some of those fair ones, because of the various things that have happened, we do relook at it. But it's only fair that we relook at it.
Okay, one last question.
Yeah, hi, I'm Pankaj Agrawal, and I'm, earlier I used to be the chief of security for Aircel Mobile. My experience and I was the authorized signatory for all TRAI and regulatory. So 6 years back, before I left Aircel, I have my experience to share, So, any data breach had a 50 crores penalty on telecom operators. And CISO also had the criminal prosecution clause. So I, used to wear that hat. And so we used to have a lot of these, cases because we had a lot of outsourcing, call center outsourcing, and all these COCO and COFO and franchise outlets and all of that. So like 8,000 full-time employees and 30,000 off-roll employees was the situation. Telcos are hugely into outsourcing, and the biggest challenge was, frauds, committed by the outsourced employees. So in some of these incidents, my experience was that to deal with these investigations involving HR, frankly, was not very successful for us. Typically, and I can quote some, actual instances where we did investigation, and where the admin guy, typically the ex-lieutenant colonel, they are the people, who really solved the problem, got this person to, who was doing blackmailing and, stealing data and sending blackmailing, series of the call records to a customer, and all those kind of incidents have come. And then in a closed door, when he threatened and, then he shared everything. And then he accepted all his, otherwise the HR was just, the whole thing was just dragging because they were talking very soft. So this is my experience that, investigation, you need, I don't know how it works in the POSH environment, but when you have a 50 crore penalty sitting on you, and when I have to say, investigation, you need, I don't know how it works in the POSH environment, but when you have a 50 crore penalty sitting on you, And when I have to send the regulatory compliances, I better make sure that we address the problem very quickly, not more than 2 or 3
No,
days.
that's a fair point, and we were going to talk about it, but we had to skip the section on breach. I mean, the breach was largely in terms of data, but we're short of
Yeah,
time.
one of the
but-
things, if you ask technology companies what keeps them awake at night, it would be data breach, because it's going to cost
besides
everybody.
POSH.
Yeah. So we are assuming that we have that in control. So yeah, so that's and I touched upon this earlier, is that we work with a lot of experts both inside and outside the organization on some of these investigations. Some of the newer areas, like I said, technology or data privacy related stuff, you won't even know what to question sometimes. You don't even know the intricacies of. So that's where some of those folks come in handy in terms of the investigation process, and they're much better than just HR folks. So in a case management scenario, it's not just HR folks or ER folks who investigate. We have a group of employees in the organization who've been ratified from various ways, and then we train them in various other ways to make sure that they're involved and help the organization really. So both of these things help. So what you said is right.
And also just a point, I think it's very important in an investigation as to who's conducting it. Is the person rightly equipped, trained, empowered to handle that kind of investigation? Otherwise it's going to drag, right? If you're going to ask the right questions, you'll get the right answers, and the person, whoever has been entrusted to the job, must be very well equipped, thoroughly educated about the policies, procedures, and the laws of the companies, and in the local labor laws as well as be empowered to carry on an investigation in a very independent manner. If that is the case, I think it'll take faster and there will be faster resolution.
So, okay, I just wanted all of you all to join me in thanking Nanjappa, Sachin, and Alipak for sharing their views. Really interesting discussions, and we'll quickly move on to the next panel. Thank you so much.